I am Jacob Hornberger, President of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to episode 16 of the JFK assassination 60 years later. When we left off in episode 15, the Secret Service agent who identified himself as Bill Smith was telling Homer McMahon, the head of the Sunday night compartmentalized team, that he had brought this 16 millimeter Zapruder film, which he was representing to be the original Zapruder film, from a place called Hawkeye Works. Now, before we examine the significance of Hawkeye Works and what was going on there, let's do a recap and put things into context here and amplify what was going on here. Recall that the official version of the Zapruder film is that Life magazine takes the film to Chicago. This is after they had struck a deal for the print rights only. This is Saturday morning that they negotiate. Richard Stoley negotiates with Abraham Zapruder. They reach a deal for $50,000, which is the equivalent of about $450,000 in today's dollars. And Zapruder hands him the original film. He retains a copy. Remember that he had 3 copies made. He had given 2 copies to the Secret Service, one of which they retained and shipped to Washington the following morning. Another one they gave to the FBI, which was shipped later that night, Friday night, to Washington. And so Life magazine has the original. It goes to Chicago. The official version is that it then goes to the printing plant there in Chicago, Life magazine printing plant, where they make copies and then they put these copies of these frames of the film in the November 29th issue, 1 week after the assassination. They were black and white, very muddy looking frames. You could hardly decipher what was going on in them. But in any event, that was the official version for 50 years. It still is the official version for that matter. And so what actually happened, as we learned, is that the film was diverted when it got to Chicago. It left Dallas somewhere around noon, maybe a little bit after noon. It goes to Chicago. It's then diverted to Washington, where it's taken to NPIC, the National Photographic Interpretation Center, where Dino Brugioni's team is. Now, you'll recall Brugioni was the foremost photo analyst in the world, absolute superstar in terms of analyzing photographs and films, and he had been a core part of the Cuban Missile Crisis analyses. He's published many books, and as I indicated, you can Google him, read about him on Wikipedia. I mean, this guy is the best of the best. And interestingly enough, it's been suggested by some people over the years that maybe these copies that Zapruder gave to the Secret Service, and one of which stayed with the Secret Service and one of which went to the FBI, that maybe one of those copies ended up in Zapruder's hands instead of the original. Well, the problem with that is that it negates this man's expertise. I mean, Dino Brugioni says there is no question but that this was the original Zapruder film. It was so crystal clear. And you'll recall that back in Dallas, the people there at Kodak had seen both the original and the copy, and they said, even though the copies were first-generation copies, that you could clearly tell the difference, that the first-generation copies were just fuzzier copies. And so here you have the greatest photo analyst probably in history that's dealing with this film. He ought to know whether it's an original or a copy, and he was absolutely certain that it was an original. So the question naturally arises, though, is that how does this film get diverted? I mean, this is Life magazine, right? Life magazine is taking it from Dallas to Chicago and supposedly to its printing press there in Chicago. You would obviously need the cooperation of Life magazine to get this film diverted over to the CIA. Well, actually, that doesn't turn out to be any problem whatsoever. You see, the guy in charge of Life magazine at this point was a guy named C.D. Jackson. And this was during the period of time where the CIA had an operation called Operation Mockingbird. And Operation Mockingbird was an operation in which the members of the mainstream press would become assets, either overt or covert, or regardless, that they wanted to do their part to win the Cold War. That remember that the Cold War was all about the Russians coming to get us. You know, they're the communists are everywhere. Remember the McCarthy hearings? I mean, everybody was exhorted to look under their beds for a red, you know, a communist. And I mean, it was just, that was how people lived during the entire Cold War. This obsession, this fear. It was dominant. It was the dominant mindset among the American people. The Reds are coming, or the Russians are coming. The Russians are coming. There was even a movie with that title, "The Russians are coming. The Russians are coming." And so what the CIA did is they had assets in the mainstream press, and sometimes the assets were just self-designated. People in the mainstream press said, "Well, we got to do our part, you know, to beat the Reds, and so we're gonna cooperate with the CIA. We're gonna whatever they need, or if we know what their official line is, we're going to repeat their official line." But in the case of C.D. Jackson was an actual overt, make no bones about it, asset of the CIA. I mean, you can Google him on Wikipedia, and you can find all kinds of things about Jackson's relationship to the CIA. Now, let me digress here a moment to do a little self-promotion. Okay, some of you probably already know that I've written a book about what I'm talking about here, the Zapruder film. It's called An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder story. And it keys off the book that Alexandra Zapruder, the granddaughter of Abraham Zapruder, wrote. Her book's called 26 Seconds. And when I read her book, there were things in there that were incorrect, but there were also things that just didn't make any sense at all. Like, you know, she talked about this code in her family. She called it a code. It's really a taboo, where they were not permitted to discuss the Zapruder film in her family, all the way up to the time she was an adult. It was just, you don't discuss this film. And so she decided that she was going to investigate this matter with great trepidation, because as y'all know, that in families, when you've got these kind of taboos, you don't discuss this and you don't discuss that, there's usually a dark secret behind it. And so families stay away from those dark secrets, and you just don't talk about them. But she decides she's going to investigate it, and I admired her. I mean, I put in my book, I commended her for doing this, because when you start delving into these dark secrets, you don't know what you're going to find. And she said that. I didn't know what I was going to find. She said, I knew I was going to get a lot of resistance from the family because everybody knew the code. But she ends up with two explanations for this taboo. One is that Abraham Zapruder was very, very guilt-ridden over having made money off the film. And then secondly, he was just totally grief-stricken. And so you just couldn't talk about it with him because his grief was so intense. Well, I'm reading this book saying, this is nonsense. This is just pure nonsense. I mean, I commend her for delving into the dark secret, but she didn't take it all the way, because those are not dark secrets. If he was so guilt-ridden over the money, all he had to do was waive the money. As you'll recall, the payments that Life magazine had structured. Remember, they didn't give him all the money up front. They structured them. And I guess I haven't mentioned what ultimately happened, so let me do another digression here. That after they struck the deal on the print rights, the deal is that Abraham Zapruder will not sell the film rights for a week, and this gives Life magazine the opportunity to put the print photographs and stuff in the November 29th issue. And then the plan was that they would then return the original to him, and he'd let them have his copy. And this would be after a week. Well, lo and behold, they contact him a couple days later and say, we've changed our mind. Now we want everything. We want all the film rights. We want all the rights to the films. We want all the films. And needless to say, I'm sure Zapruder was a little surprised. And so on Monday morning, they're meeting, and there's media hoopla, because there's there's people there that want to buy the film. Dan Rather was there representing, I think it was CBS, and all these other media's outlets, and Zapruder was there showing each one the film, and you know, deciding who he's going to sell to. Well, he finally sells it to Life magazine, and it's a total of $150,000. Now they've tripled their price now. Remember, they started at $50,000. Now they're at $150,000, and that means like $1.4 million or so for this film. And they strike this deal, and now Life magazine has everything. Okay, the film rights, the print rights, all the rights to the film. And that's when Zapruder relinquishes his copy of the film to Life magazine, and the agreement is that as soon as he gets the other two copies back from the Secret Service and the FBI, he'll deliver those also. So Life magazine has all these rights, but there's one thing. Oh, as part of the agreement, Zapruder is going to be paid a percentage of whatever money they make from the film rights, you know, leasing it out to television or the movie theaters and so forth. Zapruder's going to get a percentage of the action there. Well, lo and behold, Life magazine takes possession of this film and announces that it is going to lock it up, sequester the film, just not ever going to let anyone see it. And Alexandra Zapruder in her book says, well, the reason for this was that they didn't want to expose the American people to the violence of the film, that Americans were not accustomed to violence like they are today with 9/11 and so forth. And like I put in my book, I said, well, that's ludicrous. I mean, Americans had seen World War II. They'd seen Nagasaki and Hiroshima and all the horrors of the Korean War. And so Americans are quite accustomed to seeing horrific violence. So there had to be another reason why they were sequestering this film. But it would have been no problem to get it sequestered because C.D. Jackson was such an asset of the CIA. And so I detail this in my book. You know, I show not only the fallacies of these two reasons she gives, but I provide a lot of background on C.D. Jackson. Now, the other reason she gave that Abraham Zapruder was so grief-stricken is also ludicrous. I mean, I'm sure he was grief-stricken, but that certainly didn't interfere with his ability to get the money. And I should have mentioned that as part of this deal for the $150,000, they structured this out over many years, $25,000 a year, which seems kind of odd because Life magazine's a big operation, Time Life Inc. and so forth. They could easily afford $150,000, even though it equates to about $1.4 million in today's value. They easily could have come up with that money, but they decided to structure it out. And I think there's a reason for that, as I explain in my book. But as I'm reading her book, I'm saying, no, this makes no sense. That, okay, he was grief-stricken, but a lot of people were grief-stricken. The whole country was grief-stricken. This is the only family in the country that's got a taboo against discussing this film. No, that's not a dark side secret. And not only that, but he ends up dying, I think, in 1969, 6 years after the assassination. And the taboo continues all the way through her childhood and adulthood. So if he was grief-stricken, what would that have to do with the taboo continuing onward? So I decided to delve into this and figure out what the real dark side secret was. And I am absolutely convinced that I figured it out. And that's when I decided to write my book. But the book doesn't only explain the dark side secret, it explains a lot more. It talks about what we're talking about today, but in much more detail. I consider this book the best work I've done in the 34 years that I've done work at FFF. And one of the great helpers and helped me write it was Doug Horn. I mean, he looked over the manuscript and helped me correct errors, and he was invaluable. And he actually contributed a chapter in there But when I talk here about like the interview with Dino Brugioni with Doug Horn, I've got all the links in there. So I'd highly recommend buying the book and reading it and putting a commentary there on Amazon. So a little bit of self promotion there. But I go into detail there about Operation Mockingbird and C.D. Jackson. That C.D. Jackson and the CIA were joined at the hip. So, and not only that, but the owner of Time Life, or the founder, Henry Luce, he also had a close relationship with the CIA and the government. I mean, if you read my book, you'll see all the interconnections that go all the way back to the OSS in World War II, between Jackson and Luce and the government. And I mean, they were all tied at the hip, and they were all just having this mindset of patriotism, that they're fighting the Reds, that they need to do this to keep America from going red. So it would have been absolutely no problem for the CIA to contact C.D. Jackson and say, we need your help. It's a matter of national security. We need that film bad. And so C.D. Jackson would not have hesitated. And then when they later said, we need, if they told Jackson, we need that film sequestered, we need it hidden, we can't afford to let people see it, C.D. Jackson would have said, done. I mean, he was an asset. I mean, CIA assets normally do what they're told, especially when the two magic words, the two most important words in the American political lexicon, are mentioned, and that's national security. So that's how the diversion takes place. And so the film goes to nitpick to Dino Brugioni's team. Brugioni, sitting there watching the film repeatedly, and then does blow-ups, does the briefing boards. The film is taken away by those two supposed Secret Service agents, and then the next thing we know is Sunday night, totally different compartmentalized operation. Homer McMahon, the nitpick guy in charge of that particular Sunday night compartmentalized operation, greets another person who identifies himself as a Secret Service agent named Bill Smith, saying, I have brought the film, which now is in 16 millimeter format. Remember that once a film has been slit down the middle, you can't paste it back together. So this has to be a copy. There's no other question about it. It has to be a copy. And he says, this is the original, and I brought it from Hawkeye Works. All right, so remember I told y'all that assassination researchers were convinced that the film had to be altered. Why? Well, because they believed Saundra Spencer and Dr. McClellan and Clint Hill and the two FBI agents at Bethesda and Nurse Bell and Nurse Bowrun and all the other witnesses that said Kennedy had this massive exercise hole in the back of his head. And the official photograph, as you'll recall, shows the back of the head to be intact. So since they believed all these witnesses, they concluded that the photograph has to be fraudulent, but then they automatically concluded that the film has to be fraudulent because after the headshot comes in that hits Kennedy in the head, the back of the head is still intact. But remember, I told y'all that the only people who were capable of altering this film to make this a fraudulent film and make it look authentic were people in Hollywood. Hollywood could do it. There's no question that if they had possession of this film, they could do this. But there was never any evidence, as you recall me saying, that anybody from Hollywood had come into Chicago. And so the assassination researchers, while being convinced that this is what happened, and logically it had to be what happened if you believe all these other witnesses, but they couldn't prove it until this happened. Because as it turned out, nobody knew this at the time. Okay, the Kodak headquarters, national headquarters, were located in Rochester, New York. And at this massive headquarters facility, part of it was something called Hawkeye, like the Hawkeye building, something like that. And so that was common knowledge that Hawkeye was part of this big research and development program there at Kodak. But what nobody knew at the time and for decades after was that the CIA had a top secret facility there at Kodak's headquarters in their research and development program. And their top secret program they called Hawkeye Works. So that was top secret. The Hawkeye part of Kodak's operation there in that facility, that was common knowledge. But Hawkeye Works, top secret operation. And nobody knew it except those people that were involved there. In other words, Kodak and the CIA were in bed with each other. And this is, the mindset had to be exactly the same as it was with C.D. Jackson, Henry Luce, and all the people, all the journalists that were involved with Operation Mockingbird. That, it would be a big honor to be working with the CIA. The CIA is protecting us from the communists, the Reds. You see, they didn't see the CIA as the evil organization that it is. Oh, yeah, okay, MK Ultra, doing drug experiments on unsuspecting Americans, hiring Nazis secretly at the end of World War II, torture, destruction of torture tapes, regime change operations, state-sponsored assassinations. You see, all of that is just sort of like just buried under this mindset of patriotism that we're going to work with the CIA and it's a big honor and what a wonderful thing it is to be having this opportunity. And that clearly had to be Kodak's mindset. It may even still be Kodak's mindset. But in this facility was Hawkeye Works. Now, what is the significance of Hawkeye Works? Well, the significance was provided by Dino Brugioni. Remember, Brugioni's the world-class photo analyst. He's in charge of that Saturday night team. He tells Douglas Horne in this interview, and again, you can find that interview online that Horne does with Brugioni, but if you can't find it, buy my book. I've got all the links, all the connections there. And Brugioni says that he visited Hawkeye Works and that the guy in charge of Hawkeye Works, now remember, this is all top secret, told him, we can do anything here. Okay, and Brugioni emphasized that more than once there in his interview with Doug Horne, that there at Hawkeye Works, they could do anything. In other words, whatever they could do in Hollywood with this film, they could do here at Hawkeye Works. Okay, it's the top secret, top quality facility, top equipment, all the equipment they got in Hollywood at Kodak's research and development plant, all top secret. So how would they have done this? Well, this is where Doug Horne's chapter comes through in my new book. Because I asked Doug, I said, how would they pull this off? And it's a very complicated process, but Doug has mastered photography. The guy's absolutely amazing. And so they had what's called an optical printer, and just a top level printer. Horne talks about this online. You can find articles by him. Again, I've got references in the book, but he's in one of his articles. He's got a picture of this optical printer at that time, and an optical printer was just a super state-of-the-art copier. And the thing that was different about an optical printer wasn't like the Jameson copies. Remember, Jameson made 3 copies of Zapruder's film, and the Kodak people could tell the difference between the first generation copy and the original. On the optical printer, you couldn't tell the difference. I mean, they make it into a 16 millimeter copy. They take the original and they make the 16 millimeter copy, and it looks like an original. I mean, it's just, you can't tell the difference. And then what they do is they alter that copy. And Horne explains exactly how they do it. It's way too complicated for me. But they alter. Now, they alter the copy so that when the 16 millimeter copy comes out in altered format, it is then presented as the original. Now, remember what I told you that about how they make copies of the film, like the Jameson Company, that there's 2 ways they can do that. They can bracket, sort of like they do when they're spotting artillery shells. They'll overshoot and undershoot, and then they'll fire in the middle for effect. And that was one method. And then another method is just make your best guess and do 3 copies with the exact same exposure. Well, the standard policy is the bracketing policy. But Jameson, for whatever reason, didn't use that standard policy when he made the 3 copies of the Zapruder film. He made the 3 copies he made, he just guessed. And so all 3 exposures were the same. He used the second method. But you see, at Hawkeye Works, when they're making the copy, they don't know that. They don't know what Jameson has done, okay? And so they use the bracketing method to make their 3 copies to match up with the official scenario, 3 copies of the 16 millimeter copy that they've done off the optical printer. And they use the bracketing method. So they end up with an overexposed, underexposed, and then one right in the middle. But that's not the way that Jameson had done it. So that's how we know also that it's a copy. Because they screwed up here. Now, of course, in their minds, nobody's ever going to find out because it's all intra-CIA. And like I say, it's all compartmentalized, classified. It was kept secret for decades. So what do they do to alter this film? And this is what's fascinating, one of the most fascinating aspects about this thing. Well, there were certain things that needed to be done. And let me start out by saying that when Horn and Janney were interviewing Dino Brugioni, they showed him the Zapruder film, the extant film, the film that is represented today to be the original, the one that's in Oliver Stone's movie JFK, and the one that you can see online and so forth. Okay, that's the quote original. They show him this film, and he had not seen the film since that night. And he's looking at this film, and it's amazing. I mean, that's why I really recommend you watch the interview. I mean, this guy is as genuine as you'd ever find a person. And he's looking at this film and shaking his head and say, no. He says that headshot is not the headshot I saw. He says, how many frames on that headshot? And they said, well, it's 1 frame. And he says, no. There were multiple frames on the headshots. And then he says, the thing that struck us the most, and he says, remember, we were watching this film over and over and over again to select the frames. He says, the thing that just shocked us, is that there was this spume, like a cone of blood and brains shooting straight up into the air. I mean, and obviously that would be something that you would never forget. I mean, to see the President of the United States, John Kennedy, just riding along, and then all of a sudden, boom, and you see this cone go straight up. And he says, we were just so stunned by that. It was just such a remarkable, unbelievable, incredible sight to see this thing shooting straight up, that we kept playing it over and over again. And, well, guess what? That's not in the Zapruder film, in the extant film that he was watching. And he's just there shaking his head. No, that is not the film. Now, interestingly enough, his account of this spume or whatever, this cone going straight up and down, is pretty much matched by a family called the Willis family, who said they saw the same thing. Now, they said that it was more at an angle, like coming toward them. They were in the back of the limousine. But they said the same thing. It just shoot up. It was just a shocking sight. And, of course, there were the motorcycle cops in the back there that got splattered as well. But that is the most remarkable, or one of the most remarkable aspects of Dino Brugioni, is that he is negating the authenticity of this film. And so what they obviously had to do, they had to do something about this headshot, because they don't want it to appear that there's shots fired from the front. Remember in the autopsy, we haven't discussed the whole overall context of why they were doing this. We're going to get to that later on. But remember that their mission there in that autopsy room in the morgue, was to hide the fact that shots had been fired from the front, and to make it look like the shots came from the rear. Well, they got to do the same thing with the Zapruder film. And so if you've got this big spume of brain and stuff coming out the back of the head, you've got to do something about that. And so they end up deleting frames that are surrounding the headshot. And then if you see it, there's just this blob there on the side of President Kennedy's head. And the one frame of the headshot is just like this red blob. And we'll talk about that, how the blob gets there. But then as the motorcade is proceeding after this one frame, President Kennedy, his head is intact, which is contrary to what all those witnesses says. But it's actually worse than that. He's actually got like a black patch on that is on the back of his head that's different from the rest of his head. And I go into this in my book, but we'll talk about it more in either the next episode or the following episode as to what that black patch is all about. But what we're talking about, first of all, is the deletion of frames and the alteration of frames. So they had to delete frames surrounding the headshot, and they had to alter the headshot itself in order to match up with what they were claiming was the case with the photograph, that there had been no shots fired from the front. So now we'll wrap things up, and I'll look forward to seeing you all in the next episode. And this is episode 16 of the JFK assassination 60 years later.